This is the third generation of Gerber Aquasaver toilet. That's right, this is not a first gen Maxwell like me and others have thought about for years. This is actually the third and final generation of Gerber Aquasaver. Now that misconception has been going on for quite a couple of years, but due to some digging I've found out recently, and you can check out the recent misconceptions video I made if you want to learn more, but this is actually the third generation Gerber Aquasaver toilet, not a Maxwell. Which is strange because, fun fact, the bowls used on this and the first gen Maxwells are literally the exact same. Which is very odd. What is also odd is that this toilet was introduced as early as 2002, despite the fact that the second generation was made up until 2003, which only adds to the confusion more. And fun fact, these would actually go on to be made up until at least circa 2010, despite kind of falling off after, 2007 or so, for the Maxwell. This is kind of like an early introduction of what the Maxwells would eventually be, but like similar toilets like the Kohler and Genials, and especially something like the second gen Cold Woolworth Water Guard, aka the sixth generation of Woolworth, this would kind of have a rocky start, even though overall I'd say it's a fairly good toilet. But let's take a look at it. The overall design really isn't anything to write home about, although I will say I like the design better on this than the Maxwell. The bowl is pretty standard, but I do like the tank, which is the same Aquasaver tank they've been using since the first generation, ever since around 1994 at least. Trackway passages actually look pretty standard, as you can see here, nothing really to write home about. The trackway opening is also really nothing to write home about, although you may notice that it's actually a little bit small. What if thought was a 2-inch trackway is actually 1 3/4, which might explain some of the performance problems, especially some of the early ones that they would experience. Right here is the siphon jet, but pretty standard design. Now this particular one I'm reviewing has a very slim tank. That's because this is a 10-inch model I'm reviewing, not the standard 12-inch, because this is the best thing I got to review. But generally speaking, the normal Aquasaver tanks are pretty good size. This one's a little bit more compact considering it's a 10-inch, but I'm going to go along with it for this review. But as you can see, it just has a standard handle, which is obviously a replacement because they usually have those cheap plastic handles. You got a fluid master fill valve here, and a standard flapper. Pretty standard stuff, but they work fairly well and can be interchanged if one of them breaks, which is what I like. Let's have a look at a flush. Not bad at all. I will say though that the standard height ones tend to have better flushes overall. The pull and siphon on these are actually not bad at all. They actually pull down pretty well, and I don't ever notice any of them leaving anything behind much often. Maybe on some weaker siphons, like this one's a little bit scuffed, but I've noticed that nothing really comes out of it, as the pulling factor is actually pretty good. So overall, these actually pull and siphon out fairly well, although I will say the siphons could have been improved a little bit. Quality control, on the other hand, is just okay. I noticed that the trackway openings can be fairly inconsistent, especially with some early makes. And not to mention that the trackway openings are a lot smaller than I originally thought, as you can kind of see there. But I have noticed that these do flush out better compared to some of the later versions of the first gen Maxwell, which I guess is a plus. But definitely could have been improved upon as well. Now, performance is kind of a weird story. Personally, have never had any problems with these. However, I noticed that with some earlier ones, especially ones from like the early to circa mid-2000s, they tend to clog a little bit more due to the rocky start of the performance factor. And considering the trapway size, that might also contribute to the factor. Overall, I'd say it's okay, but man, could have been a lot better. I definitely think the Maxwell's got it right later on. Now let's have a look at forwards. Honestly, considering that these have angled ramjets, the balance looks to be fairly good. It seems to cover most of the areas, Although I will say that the back rim could use a little bit of work, but overall, I would say that the ball rinse is pretty good. And that is the third and final generation of Gerber Aquasaver. I'd say a fairly good toilet, but man did it have a rocky start, especially at the beginning. If only the trapway was a little bit better, I think this would have been a much better toilet than it is, but I'd say it's not a bad start, but could have been a lot worse. But at the same time, could be a lot better. But let's grade it. Like the second generation, I definitely think the tank and bowl combo is actually not too bad looking. Although outside of that, I definitely think it looks a little bit basic, but compared to the first generation, it definitely looks a lot better. I give it a 6. The tank parts are more or less fine. They're pretty serviceable and do their jobs pretty well. If I'm not mistaken, I think this is around the time Gerber started moving over towards traditional fill valves instead of ball cocks, which personally I prefer a lot more compared to ball cocks. So I give the tank parts a 7. Quality control for the most part is okay, though there are two things I want to bring up. One, the very inconsistent flushes, and this will be a problem on the Maxwells as well. Not just the first generation, but also the second generation. The flushes tend to differ from Aquasaver to Aquasaver of this generation, and I honestly don't know why. It might just have to be the quality control of the rim jets that's probably affecting it, or just how the toilet's designed. Who knows? I also want to bring up the fact that the performance wasn't too great towards the beginning of its life. The performance did get better towards the later years, but the first couple of years was not too great for it. And due to those two effects, I have to give the quality control a 6. The trapway looks perfectly fine except for one thing. This actually is not a 2-inch trapway like I probably expected. This actually has a 1 3/4 inches trapway, which I don't know why that is. And just so you know, the first gen Maxwell also has the same exact trapways, same size and all. So that's a little bit questionable, but at the end of the day, I'd still give it a 6. The flush on these are not bad at all. Now, I do have to count into the fact that the flushes are very inconsistent sometimes. Some are a lot more powerful than others, and honestly, I don't understand why it is. But overall, the flushes are not bad at all, and I give it a 7. The pulling and siphon power on the first generation Gerber Aquasaver is a direct upgrade compared to the last 2 generations of Aquasaver. The pulling factor is pretty well incorporated into the flush, and the siphons are generally pretty long. So in general, those two things work well, and I have to give it a 7, the best of the Aquasavers. Here's where things get weird. The performance is kind of mixed. Now, towards the later parts of its life, the performance is not bad at all, but towards the beginning, the first couple of years from the early and maybe even slightly into the mid-2000s, the performance was not so great. I definitely think the big factor here is the smaller trapway. It's not a standard 2-inch trapway, it's actually a little bit smaller. But outside of that, I couldn't tell you why the earlier ones didn't perform as well as it did, because the later ones seem to perform a lot better, which is very weird. But because of that, I have to give it a 6 overall. Since this thing has angled rim jets, the ball rinse is actually pretty good. It rinses most of the bowl pretty well and has angled rim jets, which is a nice bonus. I give ball rinse an 8. The survivability would be pretty well if it wasn't for the first couple of years that it started off with, not being the greatest with its quality, mostly with performance. Due to that, the survivability at most is going to be a 6. Let's talk about the overall value of this toilet. Well, there's no denying that it's the best generation out of all 3 generations of Gerber Aquasaver. The flush is not bad, the pull factor is actually pretty reliable, and the ball rinse is actually pretty good. However, the quality and the overall performance problems of the earlier ones do drag this toilet down a little bit. If it wasn't for those problems and the fact that the trapway is smaller than it actually looks to be, then I would definitely give this a high rating, like a 7 or an 8 in value. While I'm not saying it's a bad toilet per se, I'd dare say it's pretty good if it wasn't for those issues. There are some aspects that do drag this toilet down a little bit, to where the most I have to give it is a 6 in value. The final score of the third generation Gerber Aquasaver toilet is a 65 out of 100. There were some grounds for this being a pretty good toilet, as it does have some good qualities about it. However, it is dragged down by the quality and the inconsistent performances of the earlier ones. If it wasn't for those issues and the smaller trapway, this had the grounds for being a pretty good toilet. However, this ended up being a rocky start of what will eventually be modern Gerber. Most importantly, the grounds of the first generation Gerber Maxwell. I'm interested to see how the Aquasaver of this generation pairs up with the first generation Gerber Maxwell. Well, we'll have to see.